Community Talkies is the coming together of artists, scholars, explorers who want to be in conversation with the latest in the world of ideas. These conversations are designed to be accessible, intelligible, invigorating, and fun for anyone interested in the humanities and social sciences. Community Talkies is the official podcast of the Manipal Centre for Humanities located in coastal Karnataka, India. Welcome and happy listening.
So we have with us Professor Tanika Sarkar, who is one of the most prominent historians writing on Bengal and India. And I see her as a social historian of modern India, a major thinker and writer in the field of modern history. She's also described as the historian of the Hindu right, and especially the relation between gender and Hindu right. However, I see her more as a major thinker in the field of modern history and, as I just said, the social history of modern India, specifically because she has worked across the coordinates of gender, caste and class. So I do not think Tanika Sarkar requires a greater introduction than this, but the question that I'll ask her is to give us a sense of how she would like to describe herself, and if how does she see her work in these other domains of social history, gender domains other than gender.
Thank you in the first place for the generous introduction. In the first place, I would say that I do not see social history as an extremely clear-cut domain, a stand-alone domain, because it always is shaped by and it shapes other kinds of histories. So when I am asked to describe myself, I find it difficult to say what exactly I am. Cultural historian, a gender historian, a political historian, or whatever, you know. All of this come and all of this mingle together. And I can't even say that, what I am doing is right now I'm doing social history, but I may turn to political history, etc., because it's all a glutinous mix. But that said, the domain of social lives is something that has been missed out by our South Asian historians to a large extent, I would say. By and large, they have looked at, for a long time, nationalist historiography was predominant, and just the activities and the articulations of the great nationalist leaders. Then came subaltern studies and the elite-subaltern relationship and subaltern resistance. Some social history came into that, but not very, very markedly. Ranajit Guha's Chandra's death would be a very good example of the social history. Then post-colonial historiography focused on what the colonial state was doing or colonial knowledge systems were doing to us. So the agency passed on to the colonialists and to the West. And we were recipients, we were being molded by them, we were being shaped, created by them, reinvented by them. I think, and Marxist historiography remained mired in production relations and so on, and neglected gender, caste, very, very remarkable neglect of gender, caste dimensions of social lives, focusing only on certain kinds of class relations, not all. And so the social somehow fell through all these nets. And recently, I think it is being rectified. Your work is an example of that. And Again, to take up your work, for example, where intellectual history of a certain kind begins, where social history of class ends, you cannot separate them out. So I would say that depending on which theme I'm choosing, all kinds of histories get mixed up, which creates a mess sometimes. But to do a history of gender, for instance, for example, I'm right now working on a book, if I ever finish it, on the personal laws in the 19th century, which were where the British followed uh, followed scripture, custom, Brahmanical interpretations where the Hindus were concerned. But I see that I'm doing a history of orthodoxy, reformism, and cultural nationalism through certain laws that pertained most of all to family and gender. Okay? But it actually opens itself up to much larger concerns. I don't know how it will be read because, as a feminist historian who has worked on gender, I'm doomed to be seen on working on gender and nothing else. Not even social history. Yours was a very generous interpretation of my work. But it is a problem with us that if a woman chooses to say, to do a bit on gender, and my first book was quite gender free, I must say. But she gets branded as a feminist and a gender historian and nothing else.
Uh, what is it to do history, to teach and research in the field of history, and that is related to a question which is you can describe it as autobiographical or biographical, which is that how did you choose history as a discipline? Your early interests in history, what things does the historian focus on?
Difficult to think that long back when I was young and when I chose to do history. I think, uh, history teaching at school level was terrible. And the textbooks that we had were just, I mean, designed to kill off all interest in the past. Uh, from the children's library, I occasionally picked up a book on archaeology for children, kind of thing, and I had these grand dreams of becoming an archaeologist, discovering an ancient civilization all by myself and all that. But I could not relate to the rest of ancient India the way it was taught. My interest in history was awakened when, quite accidentally, one of my father's students presented me when I was 12 with a book, E.H. Carr's What is History, which is much criticized now. But it really fascinated me. I had never read any serious work on that kind of thing before. And it was so accessible that even a 12-year-old could make sense of it. And I began to think seriously that there's more to history than what is being taught. And I did my A levels in Cambridge. My parents were there for a year. And we had very good teachers, and that kind of fed into it. And when I came to Presidency College, Ashin Dasgupta taught us only for a year, though, and that really, uh, quickened my interest. And then I have seen, because I have lived so long, I have seen a lot of changes in the way in which history has been approached. Up to the early 70s, I think in our country, everywhere, for modern historians, nationalist historiography held the field. And then came Cambridge, Cambridge School of doing factions and cliques and things like that, which we all hated. But in retrospect, I think they alerted us to two very important things. One is the importance of the local as a site of very complex networks of relationships. And secondly, I hate to say this, but they did alert us to the question of caste because it wasn't raised at all. But they neglected broad movements, they neglected the popular realm, all the problems were there, but this was something important and interesting. So, locality, first province, then locality, and their relationship with the nation, the little kasbahs and their intricate networks of and changes, and so on. So that was interesting. That made me quite firmly grounded in the local as a window, a very necessary window into the larger questions, whether it's the national or. But when I started my research, subaltern studies was not as yet very firmly established. It was coming out, and individual books had started appearing. But at that time, I felt that the subaltern was an unproblematized category, and their internal relationships and contradictions were not addressed very much. And I have always been interested in what you call social history more than anything else, but I chose to do a political history of the civil disobedience period. Where I differed from the rest was I wanted to look at all the kinds of political movements that were going on in Bengal, not just the nationalist movement or populist struggles, but communist, revolutionary, bring them all together face to face, so to speak. And then I moved to to the 19th century, moved over to the 19th century and began to look more closely. And that interested me more, began to interest me more because well, actually, if I go back, if you let me go back a bit to what I was saying at the beginning, one was the Yechkar book. The other was the one history we were taught very well at school was the history of Bengali literature. So the only history, real history I knew was that. So going back to the 19th century, I could bring the two together. Because thanks to that I had read up, and we all read up quite systematically the many, I wouldn't say all of Bengali literature, but quite a lot of Bengali literature from, almost chronologically. So that brought that together, and I already had some exposure to archival research, which was also absolutely fascinating. It was like detective work, and detective fiction being another of my obsessions, to pursue a clue through the documents. And I know it's quite the fashion to dismiss the colonial archives as archives of power, and we all know that all state archives, colonial, pre-colonial, post-colonial, are archives of power. But you have to keep in mind that they are not writing for popular consumption or public consumption. They are talking among themselves, so they have to be very accurate about what are the problems for themselves on the ground. And that was fascinating. What frightened the colonial rulers, what problems they faced, what anxieties, what options they were considering. So that was fascinating. So in the 19th century, for the 19th century history, all of that came together, and one discovered discovered the newspaper archives, the report on native newspapers. Archival work is so difficult in our country because it stops at 47. It's very patchy up to that. History suddenly comes to an end with 1947, and it's been 75 years of Amrit Kal, so to speak, but we don't have to do that history from the archives. Occasionally, I have looked for a file in the Intelligence Bureau pertaining to the 1930s or 40s, which go on to the 1950s. And just out of curiosity, I have looked up the 1950s period, though it doesn't have anything to do with my work. And that's absolutely fascinating. If only we were given access to that and allowed to work on that, it would be absolutely fascinating, exciting. Our sense of ourselves would change. So that is the kind of research, and there is a sort of now the latest turn is in two directions: the decoloniality and to global history. And I think that decoloniality has a very flat view of colonial power effects on the world as a singular effect, which I don't agree with. There was a world of difference between settler and non-settler colonialisms. What the British did in the 13 American colonies to the indigenous population nowhere compares to what they did in India, or even what the French did in Africa, the Dutch did in Africa, would not compare with us. We were a very highly populated country. We had written, we had a well-structured state system. The British recognized that, borrowed from that. So while they did, material devastation was extreme, there was extreme racism, discrimination, and all that. But our social cultural lives were not, and our intellectual lives, I think we shaped our own modernities on our terms, not on theirs, which is why I differ from the decolonials, because it takes away all agency from ourselves. Second, about the global, it boils down to simply, a lot of the time, not with the best of them, but I'm not thinking about people like Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker, whose history of ships and voyages and pirate lives and so on are very exciting, and others. But I'm just thinking of what goes by the name of global. That is simply transactions, who goes where and who comes back, how many come back. I think very good studies have been done through stories of actual lives. Anderson's work, Mike Fisher's work on the early Indians who went to England, the first generations of Indians who went there, but they are told through, well-connected, consolidated stories. And that's the kind of global history that's worth reading, not just a history of transaction. In this day and age, there's nothing much to get excited about, so many people went there and came back there. I think Radhika Sinha's recent work on the First World War and the Indian labor court there is another very exciting kind of history. And the histories of the two world wars, I think, are very exciting. Shantanu Das's history of two histories, one generally of the First World War of, I think it's called the Touch, and the second is about Indians in the First World War. They are fascinating histories. So there are periods where, or Prabhu Mahapatra's work on Indian migrant laborers in the West Indies, that's also very interesting, because once again, it looks at actual lives, but a lot of the global history is not. Movements of commodities, movements of people, flows, labor laws surrounding them, they have their own importance, but personally I don't see it as a methodological breakthrough. And in a sense, I think we had been globalized very early because of colonial conquests. And even those who stayed back and never moved out of their city, their town, even their villages, remained intellectually, culturally connected. The British didn't gain that. The British were too insular to gain from the colonial connection. But Indians actually, I think, became or at least the Indian bourgeoisie, middle classes became highly cosmopolitan. And that's another difference with the decolonial historians. I think that cosmopolitanism is not a disadvantage. It didn't make us turn away from our own histories and pasts, but it added something.
My last question, third and last question, is on the professional aspect of your career. So, what you just said gives us an idea of the historian. The historian can be the amateur historian or the professional historian, but you are also a professional historian, which means that you have been a professor, you have been in a long career of teaching, a spectacular career of teaching mingled with research. And today, I think most of us try to think through the relation between teaching and research, because there is a dissociation that is steadily happening and being encouraged. There is a hierarchy. Research is valued, which was always valued, but teaching is undervalued or devalued compared to research. And the implications for this in higher education in general, in research in particular, I mean, if a teacher is investing, if there is a good teacher, what is the contribution to research that teaching can make in the same person or through students? That is one kind of question. And the other question is from the point of view of a researcher like you, fully invested in research, about how you see your teaching life, your the time that you devoted to teaching, and also what consequences can be there if teaching is regularly undervalued, if there is a distinction made between those who will only teach and do administrative work and another class of people who will teach and research and do maybe lesser administrative work. What does it entail for society, not just the big places, big universities, metropolitan centers, but also suburban levels, colleges, undergraduate colleges in general?
That's a very important question because that dividing line, unfortunately, is growing deeper and deeper. And you notice that generally there's emerging a trend, and the semester system encourages that, uh, that those who are big names in publications, in a global fame, and so on, they spend the 3 or 4 months or 16 or so classes that they have in a semester to teach a whole course uh, in in a very lightweight manner. Teach, the subject they teach is done in, it's engaging, but it's not substantive. So they know a lot and they can just throw around interesting uh, observations, jokes, suggestions, and that takes care of the course. So there's very little that they are teaching. It sounds very glamorous, it sounds exciting, but the content is becoming somewhat thin. And on the other hand, I have even now seen teachers in Delhi University colleges. They chose not to, I mean, they were so invested in teaching, and these are not the, sort of presidency or that level of colleges, presidency, St. Stephen's, LSR, not that kind of colleges, but slightly lesser in status. I mean, they're just giving up their whole lives to teaching and getting incredible joy and so on. And some of their students become historians, some of them don't, but I think they carry a lot of very necessary historical knowledge, sound and sober, with them in whatever profession they engage in. And history is one of those things that should help one in any profession that you go into, that all the humanities subjects, I think that that's their role. To understand the world, to understand themselves, to understand people around them, to respond to situations, etc. So even now they take that risk that they will not be known outside their colleges, beyond the student circles. Students also forget once they pass out, and so they take the risk and they are happy. They are very happy people with what happens after retirement, I don't know. As for Mufassil colleges that you are talking about. I was telling you about, I only know about that from my students' experiences. A lot of our students have to spend some time in rather remote colleges or colleges in rather remote areas. And what is it? The school teachers, the screening process through which you School Service Commission, that's right. I'm sorry. School Service Commission that doesn't give you a choice, so you can be posted anywhere, and some of them have been posted to very, very remote areas. And their experience has been that the students come with a thirst, and they come facing a lot of obstacles. It's a difficult journey in the literal sense sometimes to reach the college from their homes. And they are looking forward to something in the classroom, but at least initially, but the other teachers are actively discouraging that. And there is an element of envy. Oh, you come from a metropolitan university, you think you're ahead of us in every way, and you are trying to, give the students a new direction. You're trying to fill up libraries with books that you consider important, and we have done without those. So they are full of complaints and sadness about their colleagues and about what they could have done to students and they can't. So that's, to equalize the situation between, good universities and colleges and these suburban institutions that have been set up at great cost, and they could do a lot for a lot of students who really need it. But there it is. So in a few years you become cynical. And I have seen this happening to students of mine who have spent a few years at first struggling to get books into the library, to tell the students to read, and not being able to help them very much because it's only one course they are teaching or two courses and the rest is like that. So they become cynical, nothing can be done here. But the sadness is that they can't even concentrate on research because they don't get any research leave. So I think with my old students, my function is to push them into publishing their books, but at least their PhD thesis. But I can see that it becomes impossible.
So thank you, Professor Sarkar, for coming to Manipal and being with us here at the Manipal Centre for Humanities and in this session. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Community Talkies. Please check out more episodes on our playlist and join us again as we continue to explore emerging trends in the humanities and social sciences. This podcast has been created by the Manipal Centre for Humanities. To know more, visit www.manipal.edu/mch.